Good afternoon, beautiful people. So thankful for you here today. The library wants to welcome you and wishes you a healthy, warm, and love-filled holiday season. We hope you had time to check out the Heart of the City Farmers Market, in our opinion, the best one in town. And we hope that you will also check out the rest of the library, 6 floors of amazing books, exhibits, and very valuable resources. We acknowledge that the land we're on today, that this library sits on, and the 27 other locations of our library are on the traditional land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. Let's collectively give thanks and respect to the Ohlone people by taking care of the earth, the animals, and one another. We acknowledge that as non-Ohlone residents, we are guests on this occupied land, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, learn, and play here. We promise to uplift and respect the Ohlone people, their history, and their continued work. And we just want to make sure together and collectively we share that respect and kindness and love to one another. I want to thank the backbone of this library, who is our amazing media services people, our custodial crew, and our security who keep this place running and safe for all of us. Today's bookseller, Medicine for Nightmares, outside this door. Amazing independent bookstores are important to the city. Buy books from them. They're located on the 24th Street corridor, pretty close to Adobe Books as well, who both suffered some flood damage during that last rain. So please support your independent bookstores. They need lots of support with a $S. So today's conversation, again, I want to thank you all for coming out today and joining us. We have the amazing Obi Kaufmann in conversation with Steve Wasserman. Obi Kaufmann is the author and illustrator of the California Field Atlas, a #1 San Francisco Chronicle bestseller, along with his beautiful atlas series, The Forests of California, The Coasts of California, The Deserts of California, all published by Heyday Books. He is also the author of The State of Water and his latest book, The State of Fire, which we are here to explore today. When he's not backpacking, Obi spends his time as a painter, poet in the East Bay. Steve Wasserman, a Berkeley native and Cal grad, is the publisher of Heyday Books. He's been editor-at-large for Yale University Press and editorial director at Times Books Random House. A former editor of the Los Angeles Times Book Review, he helped start the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books and co-founded the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities. His writing has appeared in The Nation, The New Republic, The Times Literary Supplement, and more. Wasserman's new memoir, Tell Me Something, Tell Me Anything, Even If It's a Lie, is a captivating collection of essays reflecting on figures like Susan Sontag, Huey Newton, and Christopher Hitchens, while exploring politics, literature, and the changing world of publishing. Please, let's welcome to the stage Obi Kaufmann and Steve Wasserman.
All right. Thanks so much. And thank you for coming out on a very beautiful day. You had the farmer's market to choose from, but we don't live by fruits and vegetables alone. So thank you for coming to hear us natter on about this and that, and hopefully it'll provide some nutritional value. I want to thank the San Francisco Public Library and all of you who make this possible, and particularly to Obi Kaufmann, whose new book, State of Fire, we're very proud to publish. So you are going to get to eavesdrop on what I hope will be a self-serving conversation between two people whose interests not only align but overlap almost exactly here. I'm also flattered to be included in this conversation because, as it happens, I have a book, as was mentioned, of my own. I've been the midwife to the birth of many books, but only this year to one of my own. So I am experiencing, how to put it, I'm a seasoned professional. So I'm very happy to have you here because better than having my book remaindered in place, it perhaps you'll find it appealing to actually purchase the odd copy. And perhaps in its pages you will find things to both delight and provoke. So let's get started. Obi, State of Fire, a magician with paint and watercolors, the blank page. Your canvas is California. Why a little book on fire? God knows there have been a lot of books on fire. What new is there to say about this disturbing, or for most people, or for many people, this disturbing phenomenon which seems in recent years to be gaining in ferocity as it ravages more and more of this beautiful home we call California? And what struck you about this phenomena that you felt moved to write about it?
Right. Well, that's a wonderful question. That's a great way to start. You know, I think the first thing you'll notice is that these 6 books, I mean, I'm talking to you here today with my friend Steve, who's also my publisher, as the last date here on my book tour. I've been on book tour really for 90 days or so since the book came out. I don't think that count is correct, but it's fine. The 6th book in the California Field Atlas series, and you'll see like this great amplitude of like sort of poundage really of published work here between very thin books.
A lot of trees being cut down to do this.
Well,
we try to cut them down faster than they can be burned and recycle them as little vessels of knowledge and delight.
Yeah, I think that the ethics of making books out of trees is pretty low on the concerns that perhaps we should have as towards the great crimes against the ecosphere, shall we say?
Well, I'm with you there.
You know, it's the journey that I have been on with these books, and I think that in order to address your question about why the State of Fire, with its subtitle "Why California Burns," is a thin book. You need to understand the context that I have, the premise that the path that I have walked, if you will. Follow this cognitive thread from the beginning to where and how this book emerged, with its particular posture towards this, this subject that has the potential to impact California like no other subject, really, no other economic sector, no other vector of stress and disturbance across the California landscape going forward in the next, what do we have here left? 76 years left in the 21st century. What we have here in the State of Fire is a investigation, really, I believe, into the indigenous traditional ecological knowledge of what stewardship is by way of fire application, and the history of that stewardship over the past several 10 to 15,000 years at least, the coevolution of ecosystems in California by way of anthropogenic design. And it is that ubiquity of stewardship reciprocation across California's many varied indigenous sovereignties that really produced what is in effect the California we all know and love, an entity that is at its heart artificial, completely engineered by this object in the universe, the human hand, that it is by decisions that humans make and have made and continue to make, or perhaps even not make, that California burns. And telling that very specific story about how Every single arboreal habitat in California has a relationship to the normalized return of fire on the land. Either it's adapted to it or it's even dependent upon it. The origins of that plant biodiversity is wholly a human story to tell.
So let me translate this a little bit.
Sure.
As I read your book, instead of a story that could be translated into a Hollywood horror movie called Fire, you instead take a deep, you do a deep dive into deep time and say, no, actually, fire is a good story. Because if we understand fire as part of a natural process, which has been largely lost to us because of what humans very recently have done to adapt the state to our sometimes blinkered purposes.
That's right.
Without sufficient acknowledgement or knowledge or even curiosity about how those humans here before European contact lived with fire in a more harmonious relationship to it, we would be a lot better off, because fire is part of a good story about resilience, regeneration, and without that fire, we can't hope to understand the ways in which California came to be, the diversity of species that thrive on this land. And were we to learn more about that story, it might provide a prescription for how we might more successfully steward the land, both in the present and in the future. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, it is for the most part. I mean, I would just deviate a little bit with you when you use the word natural.
Fair enough, because you make a point in the book that these words, natural and other words, are very charged words. But tell us more
Exactly
about that.
correct. Exactly correct. Like what you know, I am an artist. My background is in biogeographic cartography of California, right? But I engage this technology of poetry. This is a word that I, in recent months, have really claimed as core to a certain kind of identifying voice that I transmit to my community. And I'm not talking about poetry as necessarily like, you know, the sitting in reverie on a cliff writing verse or whatever, you know, that romantic notion.
That's what I think of you as when you go out. That is my whole
Okay, well, I
image
do
of
do
you.
some of that, but what I mean is like this, the very serious practice of engaging this vanguard of language, forming these new cognitive tools, and I think we have to really examine like words like nature, words like wilderness, and their colonial roots, and how we engage them on a societal level, on a political level, especially towards like something like getting right with fire, this quality of the more than human world across the landscape, this nutritive force, really, as it was applied and respected by millennia and used to sculpt California's ecosystems. I think like coming back to that point again and again about how California as a geographic entity, its living pattern of botanical relationships, tree associations, forest distributions, grassland patterns, biodiversity itself in California is really, its modern configuration is really only about as old as the Great Pyramids. It goes back to about 6,000 years or so in the middle, in the Holocene the climate optimum, when San Francisco Bay became a physiographic entity. When we finally see the emergence of 600 some odd shell mounds around the Bay Area, for example, and as your predecessor Malcolm Margolin so excellently documents in his classic The Ohlone Way, it's like this modern thing that is California is really that. It's really something quite new, and it was something completely different before, to such a degree that, like the fire historian Stephen Pine said, in California, where fire exists like it exists nowhere else on the planet because of this indigenous tradition that is so sophisticated and so old, and yet 6,000 years old and new, that pyrodiversity equals biodiversity. Pyrodiversity being the application of mixed severity mosaic burn patterns on the landscape everywhere across all 100 million acres of California. We have these patterns of emergence that are not only defined by this tool, but are yearning at this point, after 170 years of American California, if you will, yearning for it. That probably gets me to my next point about how California remains in a severe fire drought, which is such a counterintuitive thing. I think given the story in the media that we're fed every night on the nightly news, or every time there's a fire on our phones alert us to this story of
let me understand.
tragedy and destruction.
So rather than regarding fire as an enemy,
Right.
do you regard it as a friend up to a point? And where is that point exactly?
So interesting that you're even you're giving it agency, almost like it's like a being, right? A friend. Well, it's a tool. Like how is the coffee cup, or is it something else? Because certainly fire is not necessarily biologically alive, like you and I appear to be in this phenomenological universe, but what if it's, and this is something that I sort of propose in my book, getting back to this poetic idea, which I give myself license to do, given my own background and my own vocation and my own sort of like platform that you've afforded me here in the publishing of these books, is that there might be another category of life itself that fire occupies, which is something like ecologically alive. Fire behaves so often as a biological entity. It consumes, it can die, sometimes it sleeps, it's voracious, it has all of these like qualities that seem
Those
to
qualities
be like
would,
an entity.
Those qualities would on its face seem to beg the question of whether it's morally or entomologically advantageous to regard it as an enemy or a friend, because your characterization of it having elements that almost give it a living quality does suggest that we might consider what relation we might have to other elements that have, as it were, living qualities. So it doesn't seem to me a bad question. We're a state of 40 million people.
Right.
We are clustered in megalopolises that encroach on areas where not very many people live.
Right.
We have bent to our purposes for ill or for good, however those might be defined, often blundering our way because the road to hell is paved with good intentions notoriously, and the law of unintended consequences is at play. So the question of how 40 million people live with this element that you've identified as fire, which in your telling has a dramatic and immense role to play as a constituent part of the structure of biodiversity and the thing that gives us California, which, as you describe in the book in very compelling ways, both poetic and otherwise, as a living story that continues to unfold. Do you take hope from that story, or are you, well, let's put it another way. If it is a story, which also seems to be a kind of human need to impose on phenomena the very notion of narrative or story, but let's, for the purposes of a conversation, say it is a story, what's the moral?
It's probably rooted somewhere in justice, I would say.
Injustice.
Injustice, that's right.
Okay, that's a very interesting notion.
It-
Does
well-
the universe give us an e-ticket to equity?
Well, I think that the process of writing these books, like I began this book, my first book, really the bridge project, really between publisher emeritus Malcolm Margolin and incoming publisher Steve Wasserman, was the California Field Atlas, and this book has a particular problem that I aim to begin to remediate with the publishing of The State of Fire. And that problem is that there is definitely like a human-shaped hole in this account. Here I am in love, drunkenly so, with the more than human world of California to such a degree that I may have inadvertently perpetuated a kind of blind injustice towards the presence, the ubiquity of this tool and these people and this sophisticated relationship of reciprocation that stretches back 1,000 years. And that is a colonial attitude towards what, here's this word, the natural world is. There's a chapter in my new book, The State of Fire, called "The Tragedy of Misconceptions," right? And this gets to the idea of like John Muir, bless his heart, had no real idea what he was looking at when he was pontificating on the church-like beauty of California. What he's really looking at is a sophisticated ancient indigenous technology of fire applied to the land. And like and then you can look at the industrial and political applications of that mindset across California, and you begin to see like the first laws that the Spanish passed by order of the crown against the indigenous people were anti-fire laws because they wanted to turn this place into livestock pasture with the coming of Junipero. So we have a source vector of like tribal violence towards the application of fire, and then you also have like this bad science factor too, where you just have the Gifford Pinchot, who was one of the early directors of the United States Forest Service, who, after the Big Burn, as they called it, ravaged the border of Montana and Idaho with Canada. It was like 3 million acres in 36 hours went up in flames, and this was largely due to locomotives. This changed forest policy overnight. The idea, Gifford Pinchot, who was the director of the Forest Service at the time, who was trained in forestry in France, the science of the time was that if you suppress fire enough, fire will go away. Right? And so these misconceptions, these hypotheses that were untested but were taken as axiomatic truth. And then you have this third component with it, which is the industrialization of the commodification of forests into this thing called timber. With the fire suppression, you have like these elements of like that all add up to this colonial attitude that is always necessarily exploitative. And I wonder about my relationship to this place, to potentially obsessive degree. How do I be from here? You know, we had a land acknowledgement earlier. It's like, well, what does that mean? Did I just write a cheap receipt to keep doing what I'm doing? How do I engage the colonization of my own mind? Is there any recourse for that?
This is probably one of the more radical and refreshing chapters in this book, State of Fire, because to the best of my knowledge, which may be quite limited here, I don't think any other book that I've encountered yet on fire, its causes, its future, has addressed, even in a cursory way, you're placing front and center this idea of a colonial relation to fire and the attempted extermination of California native peoples in particular, and as well as teasing out from what we can learn from those experiences with respect to stewardship and living in harmony with fire. That's an essential, I would say, it almost occurs, it's almost the fulcrum of your book. It's sort of at the center of it, and you frame your explorations and your reflections on either side of that really important piece.
I'm not sure if harmony ever exists. You know, that this is always just a ebb and a flow. This is the story of ecology, which is the study of consequences. Really, like it's always just always establishing parameters of some sort of homeostasis. Homeostasis, I think, is a better word than harmony. Like it's, you know, within these successive cycles of what has been and what will be, we have different disturbance regimes that.
Well, that's a good point, because harmony suggests a kind of utopia where the thing that is studied is in perfect balance, and it denies the role of contradiction, and it is fundamentally at odds with the notion of a phenomenon that has a dynamism at its heart.
That's
and
right.
You are describing a dynamic process in this book.
And I struggle, Steve. You know, I struggle with the context for democratic communities in a modern, especially with relevance to the modern application of the word freedom. What is freedom, but doing what you want, which is just so. I mean, here we are on the 13th anniversary of Christopher Hitchens' passing, and I know just I think
This is what's called a pivot.
this is a pivot. I think that we're ready to pivot, because I think this is really important, because I think that you bringing up even the idea of utopia, and you asked me about hope earlier, right? And what is the interface between ecology and political reality, given the advent of technological disruption, and given even the technology of the book itself, which is, I mean, I cannot make an app out of this book. Like this is. We were talking.
These are anti-app books.
These are because certainly a book is that. The book being the capsule of deliverance of what might be, in my estimation, the perfect length for one human thought, right? Like the digestible notion of the book, this pillar of Western civilization, as it is wrapped up in liberal ideas of what freedom is, what the California character might be in the 21st century, related to, as it must be, ancient patterns in the landscape. Like, I don't see any separation of those two. We're talking about, I mean, for my love of Christopher Hitchens, he was very much like, he perpetuated this Cartesian mindset where there is no difference between, well, there is the world of the mind and there's the world of the body, and then there's something called nature, perhaps. Like, I think that if I could, and this is what my next few books are going to be about, inject the landscape itself with personhood, if you will. I think that this has the potential to change, to radically transform California's economy over the next 70 years. And I think the inroad is this idea of getting right with fire. And I think that getting right with fire will set up adaptive and resiliency patterns in the economy of California as a political entity, as it does also set up the state for a pattern of, as I say, increased adaptivity towards the major injuries this way cometh from climate breakdown by way of anthropogenic global warming. So I think that if what I'm proposing here is bold eco-philosophy, right? Ecological philosophy, and that has to do with core disruptions of what it is to be a Californian, an American, from this place, from anywhere. And it's not some kind of destination that I'm going to get to. I don't know necessarily if I'm any closer than I was before I started writing these books. But I do know that engaging the process, the space of the writer, the space of the artist, by engaging this conciliant notion of bringing together these worlds of the aesthetic and the physical sciences and, the humanities, like a new story unfolds that completely annihilates not only any argument, but the need to argue at all.
Well, that would be a very sad day for me, because I live for argument and disputation. And to cite Christopher Hitchens, who I knew very well and published his first books, today happens to be the 13th anniversary of his untimely death at age 62 from an overwhelming like of cigarettes and alcohol. Didn't do him much good. But he also was someone who lived for disputation, the kind of argument, civilly, if sometimes by turns ferocious, but argument, in the best sense, was a way of helping to sharpen one's arrows, to put in one's quiver, to unleash at the targets that most deserve to receive them. I do not look forward to a world that is so in which every contradiction has been resolved and every story has been
Of course not.
have its moral. But what is enjoyable about your book, and I think at least for me, what its contribution does is it helps complicate a story that many people think they know. Fire bad. No fire's good. Let's run to the thing that seems like, don't play with matches, you'll get burnt. Only you can prevent forest fires. I'll never forget it. For me, Smokey the Bear by Richard Scarry. I grew up in Oregon, and at a time when, we were full of these stories of the ravages of fires. And for me, Smokey the Bear was a story as emotional as Bambi was for other people. I'll never forget, it was my Homer. It was my Iliad and Odyssey. I'll never forget the panel in the Golden Book of Smokey the Bear, where Smokey's mother tells him that should fire come, what you need to do is you need to climb the tallest tree and cling to the tree. Cling to the tree. And so one day, there's a smell in the forest. And Smokey looks around, and the smoke is billowing and billowing, and finally, and the animals are running, and the birds are fleeing, and every creature is running for their lives. And Smokey's eyes are smarting, and he now can't see his mother. So it's one of these separation stories that, go right to the heart. And he loses his mother, and he remembers, oh, I have to climb the tree. Climbs the tree. His eyes are so smarting from the smoke, he closes them, and time passes. He awakens, and he looks out on a smoking room. The forest is unrecognizable. It's strangely quiet. He can't hear birds. He hears nothing. And there's just blackened stumps, and his skin is singed. And that image was like, for me, was like an image out of John Hersey's description of Hiroshima after the bomb was dropped. I mean, it was a kind of apocalypse. It was an absolute calamity. And now we have fire raging through communities called, curiously enough, even ironically, paradise. So the paradise on the land of California, that great vision where we could have a dream of endless prosperity, indeed, equity for all, where, as one historian famously said of the gold rush, the world rushed in, and where we could build endlessly. That seems to have come to a crashing end with, and the standard bearer of the ending of that dream of endless prosperity is the curtain of fire, not an iron curtain, but a wall of fire. How do we separate an unsentimental examination of fire, its propensities, the elements that constitute it for good or for bad, if those are even words that are to be enrolled in this conversation? How do we rid ourselves of the metaphoric aspect of it, which seems indissolubly braided together in the very DNA of our language?
Oh, that's wonderfully evocative. Yeah, I remember those stories. I mean, the first few minutes of Bambi, right? Or when the deer are leaping from the wildfire. This is not how animals actually interact with fire at all. This is one of the. If I could answer your question, it would be like what we have here in the emergence of fire ecology. For the past 20 years now, fire ecology has been divorcing itself from colleges of forestry, the agriculture, the silviculture, the production of timber. Fire ecology is now its own course of study in universities across the West and beyond. And one of the things that fire ecology reveals, statistics, physical sciences, good data, is that fire has no appreciable impact on wildlife species at all. In fact, it often increases diversity and unlocks new energetic and nutritive forces towards greater resurgence and adaptivity they're following. For example, we have this image of massive fires are coming for us, like that wall of fire as you just described. And yet, for example, there are more black bears in California than there have been in the entire geologic history of California. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife just upped its population to about 65,000 black bears across California right now. And this has a lot to do with their ability to opportunistically profit, as we could say, at the wildland-urban interface. Right, the black bears are very good at gleaning nutrients from human neighborhoods, but then they're also missing their big sister, the California grizzly bear, that was its chief competition up until exactly 100 years ago this year.
I think the last grizzly was either shot in Oakland, actually, not far from where Lake Merritt is today. Somewhere.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
I haven't heard that one.
I may have just made that up.
1924. I heard that it was down in Sequoia National Forest, but yeah.
That's probably right.
but I think the larger point is that this story that we were fed, I mean, Smokey the Bear, perhaps one of the greatest advertising campaigns in the history of advertising. Smokey the Bear radically, as I said, annihilated the argument. How can you compete with that story? And as you said, it goes straight to the heart. That's a story for and about humans, not for and about bears, right? So there's a different relationship to story, and in fact, the animals that populate these stories. You want to read some good ones? Check out my co-host for the podcast Place and Purpose, Greg Saris, who is a friend of yours, friend of mine, and the chairman of the Federated Indian of Grayton Rancheria up there in Santa Rosa. He wrote a number of books. How a Mountain Was Made, about Sonoma Peak and the Southern Pomo Coastal Miwok people, traces a very different character of fire. You will not find the despairing bear on top of the tree. In fact, you will find a relationship between this incredibly dynamic cast of personalities, all of whom are very robust and nearly Shakespearean in their depth and their ability to in their depth of character, in their pride and in their hubris and in their ability to feel passion and love and all of that stuff, to emote. And Greg captures that as the steward of his people's ancient stories in really cogent ways, as you know. And yet, turning to these stories, listening to the people who have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years might be an excellent inroad to exactly overcoming these stories from the middle, these very young Disney-ish stories from the middle 20th century that might be reaching a certain expiration date of relevancy, if you will. And in fact, I believe that ultimately the confluence of this traditional ecological knowledge that is encoded in these ancient stories, along with the scientific innovation of things like the advent of fire ecology, might be this pulling, the key that pulls the sword from the stone. I'm mixing images there, but you know what I mean. It's like that is a very powerful societal tool, perhaps even alchemical, that transforms this narrative of 100% destruction, 100% tragedy, into something that is reminiscent of, or fulfilling somehow of a promise of a broken covenant, with the ecosystems of California that has been absent. Fire as a covenant. I stand in these old growth forests that are now water stressed, overpopulated, plagued with fungus and insect populations. These trees that are young and dumb, as opposed to these old, these spaces that have been maintained, that were these intelligent spaces of these forest communities. I mean, and the young and dumb trees seem to be crying, "Where did you go, humans? We had a covenant for thousands of years. You give us fire, we give you food. We give you nutrients. We give you reciprocal community to this more than human world. We give you grand diversity." Fire opened the supermarket. It was the thing that opened the way for these pyro-diverse economies in Indigenous California for thousands of years. There were more people living here than there were anywhere else at time of contact north of Mexico City, across the continent. There are more tribal sovereignties in California than there are in the rest of the continent, north of Mexico. There are more languages spoken in California than there are in the rest of the continent. And what you have across, on a planetary scale, whenever you have an increase of heterogeneity in indigenous languages spoken locally, you also have an increase in corresponding biodiversity across the landscape. This is just a ecological, sociological phenomena, and so what we have here is this precious miracle moment when we recognize these factors here as the world continues to transform and all bets seem to be off.
But is it a practical model to look toward the distant past of a land that, at best, so historians tell us, based on inherently fraught data, a past where California, before European contact, was estimated to harbor somewhere on the order of about 600,000 people, yes, separated into many indigenous tribes, carefully husbanding the bounty of an extraordinary legacy of, as you rightly described, biodiversity. But what genuinely practical application can that really have to a state that boasts 40 million people? So the question comes, have we come up against a somehow a boundary that if we cross it imperils our species? Of course, the narcissism of our species is unrivaled. I mean, where is it written that we should have a kind of immortal relation to our existence on the planet? 99.9% of all species are now extinct. Yes. And extinction may well be, likely it is, almost certainly it is, part of a quote-unquote natural life cycle where other species get generated or die off, yes, or are condemned to extinction. But what practical lessons can really be teased out from the otherwise admirable story that you're at pains to tell?
It's right. It's right. I think it's a wonderful point. Let me answer that question, because I think the answer is unequivocally yes. That studying the deep past is critically important, especially at this juncture. In State of Fire, I go over the history of aridity, drought, climate change across the California floristic province over the past 10,000 years. And what we have find is the advent of a number of what are called by paleoclimatologists mega droughts across California. The period between 1850 and 1950 was the wettest century in the past 3,000 years in California. Okay, so you know, be that as it may, we get so concerned in this current American California about 5 years of drought. Oh me, oh my. Wait until there's 40 years of drought. Wait until there's 100 years of drought. Now, California knows how to get hot. We don't. And what I mean by that is that there were times, including the mid-Holocene climate optimum that I referred to earlier, that was 3 degrees centigrade on average year after year warmer than it is today across California. And yet it doesn't appear that in that time a single stitch of biodiversity, a single species was lost at all. It was all here and remained here. And studying ancient patterns of how that biodiversity maintained itself, that's a key for then applications to some sort of engineered, some sort of architecture of resiliency in our own communities. I mean, we're missing a few wonderful creatures, ecological engineers. I'm thinking about the beaver that affects hydrology. I'm thinking about the salmon that affects arboreal nutrients across the landscape. I'm thinking about the missing grizzly bear that has a whole host of cascading effects, being the apex predator that it was. So I'm thinking about these incredibly important species that supported human communities, that provided these ecological services, priceless. Okay, so understanding the historical nature of those values is imperative for whatever comes next. Now, whatever does come next, Steve, now this is where I take my foot off the gas with what I know. Because I prefer to be more comfortable. I think my work shines more at the beginning of the process, the beginning of this poetic, transformative genesis of this cognitive thread that might lead from from poetry towards scientific investigation, which would be what do we need to pay attention then to? What are the questions that we have not yet asked? And then that precedes something like policy eventually, and there's this cognitive thread from how ideas spread towards ultimately, which is what policy. So when people ask me so what are we gonna do? It's oh, come on, we got our best minds working on it. Let's leave that to other people. I'm not running for office. I don't have a political platform about this is what we should do for, X, Y, or Z. Here I am following this aesthetic experience, right? I maintain that these works must be works of art. I don't present them. I can't present them. I mean, they're data-driven. They're, well-cited. Heyday's got me, editors upon editors, all of this kind, we're really into getting the facts right. But ultimately, this is art. This is designed to the way they're organized, the way they're configured is towards my own satisfaction. And I'm just inviting you along. I'm not really trying to satisfy you. I'm not trying to win you over. And if I start to do that, it's all going to fall apart.
This reminds me 7 or 8 years ago, when you made an appearance on behalf of the California Field Atlas at the Mechanics Institute. It was crowded, packed with people, and there was a line of people afterward wanting to ask questions. And I think the second questioner was a woman who stood up holding a copy she had just purchased and brandishing it, not exactly in an accusatory fashion, but in a more bewildered fashion, said to you, how exactly is one to use the California Field Atlas? And I'll never forget Obi's answer. You looked at her and you said, without a trace of irony, oh, ma'am, this is a completely useless book. Whereupon the audience stood up and applauded, and they all bought a second copy. I was the publisher, and I thought, oh, this is not broken. I'm not going to try to fix it here. So it's interesting to me. It's not that you propound or propose an aesthetic theory, as it were, to approach these very complicated problems. But one of the charms and delights of Obi's approach is to combine a kind of fever dream love affair with the land, which is quite personal, with an artistic way of describing them in order to illuminate and deepen our understanding of complex processes whose salient factors are at best difficult to tease out, not to mention to try to keep them in their proportionate relation one to the other. All of which is to say, and perhaps this is a good moment to invoke before we open it up to questions, the great and late Lawrence Ferlinghetti's admonition that one must always keep an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out.
That's good. That's good.
If there are any questions, perhaps the woman here, our host, could bring the microphone to you. And
Don't be shy.
Yeah,
please.
don't be shy. I really appreciate y'all coming out Sunday afternoon. You had a million other things to do, and you came here to sit with us. Very good.
And if you don't want to talk about his book, I'm happy to talk about mine.
That's the other thing, Steve. I mean, I love this book so much, Steve. It's interesting. The State of Fire is the first book that did not crack San Francisco Chronicle's top 10 bestseller. And after being on book tour for 3 months or so, I began to have a reason why. People are afraid of fire. I think that there is a psychological, like, I often get that, like, oh, this is a beautiful, the forests of California, the coast of California, and then it's like state of fire. Why California? Ugh. It's like you can hear their voice drop.
Maybe we should have titled it "Burn, Baby, Burn," a novel.
Well, I try, despite all of, I really want my language to not be rosy about this subject, and because I understand that I'm dealing with real trauma of people who were sold something
And now can't get insurance.
and now can't get insurance, right? Yeah, literally. But I mean sold like an ideology of like what is this? And you have this.
Well, before we go there, let's get a question.
Let's get a question. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Before we go there, I always want to talk about Steve's book, and I was like billed at the top of this thing, but like at the top of this event today. But I'm like, let's talk about. We're gonna have to do another event, I guess. Okay. Yeah.
I actually, so I have firefighters in my family, woodland firefighters. I have some hotshots in my family, and one of them has talked about the changing face of forest fires. That when he started 30 years ago, that 30,000 acre fire was a big fire, and now it's not a big fire, and how that the fires that he has been battling lately are burned so hot that there is no organic matter left when the fire is done, that it's just pretty lifeless. And so I am just curious, given that perspective on the state of fire.
That's right. Even organic matter. That's right. Yeah. Even in these intense burn zones, in severe burn zones, 100% mortality. We're talking. I opened the book with a study of the Carr fire, which was east of Reading, right? And so that was, I was the artist in residence. Yeah. I'm sorry. What? Oh, yeah. So I was the artist in residence for the National Park Service up there at the Whiskeytown National Recreation Area in the spring of 2023, 5 years after the Carr fire, right? And the Carr fire was like, I mean, that's it spawned a fire tornado, half-mile wide, 3 miles tall, punched a hole in the stratosphere, right? It burns at 2,500 degrees. At that temperature, your house doesn't burn. Your house vaporizes in 5 minutes. Your porcelain tub is gone. Your stove, everything is gone. It's just vaporized. And these are nuclear weapon equivalent yields of energy. And yet 5 years later, just 5 years later, we're dealing with a super bloom. We're dealing, I challenge the lack of organic matter, because when we see the grayness of a post-fire landscape, what is actually happening, which is outside our realm of perception, is that ground is getting shocked with nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, potassium, all of these necessary ingredients for this stuff called fertilizer. And after the Carr fire, botanists in the National Park Service have discovered 3 new species of flower that have completely new to science. We understand the genus, but we don't have a species name yet. And you can go see them. Seeds that have been in the seed bank, but have been unpollinated since, as you say, the fire regimes of California, specifically that one little biome, the fire regimes of California have been so completely deformed by human policy, which leads me to, one of the main premises of the book is that California burns because of decisions that humans make. It's always been that way. And so what do we do with this information, right? And in countering that, and, there's a lot of Anthropocene fire, 21st century fire here. It's different in California somehow. California has increased in temperature year after year, average, since 1895, about 1.8 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. No, I'm sorry, Celsius. It's like closer to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's since 1895. So we've already blown past IPCC averages for global averages. You know, it's even more in the desert, and it's even more in Southern California too. And when you get that increase of temperature, you get the increase of aridity in the atmosphere and in the soil, and it's a geometric arc. The more temperature goes up, the greater the vapor deficit in the wood body itself. So the trees are actually drier and more stressed because of global warming. So you often hear like the adage climate fires, right? And that, I believe though, that the data suggests that it's not just in fact secondary to climate breakdown by way of anthropogenic global warming is the prevalence and ubiquity of invasive grasses across the state, and the way that they have propagated themselves and completely have dominated over the past several hundred years. And in the 20th century, that was just augmented with the livestock industry across the state. There's just what these grasses want to do, and these are grasses that evolved across the Eurasian steppe. They want to turn everything into the Eurasian steppe, and they do that by burning every year. That's what the Eurasian steppe does. Like millions and millions of acres just go up, and it's high intensity, low severity fires because it just moves very fast across the landscape with no trees. Just burns out all the saplings and everything, and what you get then is these return intervals of fire that completely break down woodland succession, its ability to recover. Right, you get not ecological succession, you get ecotype change. Woodlands become grasslands, and that is a perilous trajectory towards simplification. So how do you combat this? Well, you combat it with diversity, biodiversity, endemic diversity. But the invasive grasser problem, the global warming, all of this is in my estimation, the remediation, the antidote towards it is protecting, stewarding this miracle that's right here, right now. And what that miracle is that although all of our natural landscape types are endangered, critically endangered, we have a very low extinction rate in the state. It's less than 1%, as a matter of fact. All the pieces are still here. We've lost some beautiful, charismatic creatures like that gorgeous piece of megafauna that we put on our flag, the California grizzly, but the pieces are still on the board. And you see things like the removal of the 4 dams on the Klamath River 6 weeks ago. That now that we're seeing coho salmon return for the first time the day after the dams come down. They're waiting, right? These are these symbols of like this stewardship, this re-engagement to such a degree. And I'm a policy wonk. I follow these issues very carefully. And I'm here to tell you, like, to a degree, like, I'll play tennis all day long with those ideas that we, for every point of despair, there's a point of hope. Even though I just painted a weird, scary picture, and now that a lot of these decisions come from the guy sitting in the Oval Office, and it looks like, for example, the climate movement itself is going to have to transform from something like a movement of prevention towards a movement of adaptivity, because that game is over, and we need to wake up to that political fact. But nonetheless, California looks like we're going to top $4 trillion in nominal GDP this year. We're going to rival. Looks like we're going to overtake Germany to become the 4th largest economy in the world. Like, we've got the economic power to do it. Do we have? Here's that word "we." I'm very uncomfortable with the word "we," but is there the capacity to transcend quarterly shareholders' want for profit in order to engage a world where California is still a potent force, where our species itself is a potent force 100 years from now, 500 years from now, 5,000 years from now. Let's have that conversation. Yes.
So a couple things. I wanted to respond to, Steve, your comment about there not being a lot of written text that foreground colonialized landscapes within this concept and discussion of fire. And I want to point out a couple pieces which I think you are part of this emerging, and which I appreciate, emerging pulling apart of one's place within the colonial space. And so Mangela Martin's The Last Fire Season is a really great book in this respect. Engineering Eden by Jordan Fisher-Smith is a bit more legal-centric, but is really looking at how do we transform these outdated concepts that are very Homo sapien-focused. And so, yeah, I think it's great that the voices are coming out through our author community of Indigenous practices, Indigenous voices, Indigenous examples that we can really learn from. And then the second thing, yeah, fire's scary, and I'm part of a land art eco-stewardship project up in the near the South Fork of the Yuba River called Yuba Libre. We're a Source to Sea project thinking about how we, like salmon, sort of fertilize the upper regions of the bioregion, and then how the waters that come and fill the San Francisco Bay then feed us here in our creativity and that kind of thing.
Yes.
And we live in an area that has, or we operate, I don't live there, in an area that has experienced major burn scars. The Jones fire came through a couple of years ago, and then a few years ago, and then a couple of years ago, we had to evacuate our space because of an overheated engine in a truck that just ripped across the landscape. But I'm saying a couple of things. It's not a question, it's a comment. I don't know who said that. But what I want to say is that this fear that we had of living in a very fire-prone area, or being in a fire-prone area, was really mitigated by connecting up with Cal Fire on a grant and managing that landscape, doing fire remediation, setting prescribed fire burns, cutting the branches up to a certain place, thinning out the landscape to a degree that we stopped a fire coming through just because of the work we had done on the land. And that inspired the other properties around there to do the same thing, who had also been living in fear of their properties, their livelihoods being overtaken by the spread of fire quickly. So I guess I'm just offering an antidote to the fear, or to this idea of how do we get past the large-scale Smokey the Bear kind of fires. And I think it's a small step every time, and it's just continuing to open, as you do yourself, to paying attention to the landscape and to how we can be a little bit more in concert with these really ancient ideas.
Thank you for that. That's all very important and encouraging to note. Maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll sign books and be able to engage in a more informal dialogue. Gentleman over here.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. Speaking, I know you didn't want to get into political recommendations, but you probably have thought of the future and what's likely to happen. And so I kind of want to ask, what do you think is going to happen to the communities such as Jackson, Auburn, the Grass Valley? In 50 years or so, 50 or 60 years, you think they'll look a lot different? Will people be migrating up and down like the Indians used to? How do you, given that California's still going to have 40 million people and still going to have a ton of dams, even in 50, 60 years, even if they have 4 fewer, how do you look ahead optimistically and poetically?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you're talking about wildland-urban interface. You're talking about South Yuba River watershed, one of my sacred churches. I love the work that you're doing. Fire is always coming. Fire will not be denied. California has such a long fire drought now that we're seeing really deleterious aspects in the landscape, regardless of what you're talking about, the manual design of that interface. For example, across the Sierra Nevada right now, we are looking at the possible extinction of all 5-needle pine trees, including sugar pines, in the next 90 years because of a fungal blight that's spreading through that only fire can remediate. So there is the Forest Service knows this. Above Sonora, I spent a couple of weeks earlier this summer with a ranger who is showing me the prescribed burns that they do on the ridge, and prescribed burns are on this level are extremely logistical. They're so complex in their deployment. They are certainly something like quasi-military. We're talking about 600 fire practitioners. We're talking about Class 6 engines on the ground, going over these little mountain roads as we're putting to the torch, 5,000, 10,000 acres, whatever, and then the green comes right back, and so we're opening up the forest. You can actually see through the forest again, and using fire to do that. This helps all manner of wildlife. This reinforces human communities towards whatever destructive event might come. So this attitude, though, it's interesting. I was in Nevada City doing a talk at a little shop up there, and it turned out everybody that attended the talk that day were all women, and there were a number of, or at least they, to my eye, identified as women, and or read as women, and we sat in a circle, and there were a number of Indigenous women there from the Nisenan Nation, and I was talking about my experience at the Stanislaus National Forest with the fire practitioners with the Forest Service, and I was like, there's one aspect that's missing though, and that aspect is land medicine. And I thought that was such an interesting idea because I don't really know what that means. Here I am, allowing myself to be mystified by these greater stories that somehow reach back and reach forward at the same time. So what the future might look like, it's like, Winston Churchill said that the deep future will look like the deep past. So that's a possibility. The deep future. I look to the great writers. I look to Ursula Le Guin in Always Coming Home. I look to the idea that after all of this is returned to the dust from which it is made, where will humanity be? I share your assessment that extinction is an axiom to all biological life. Every species becomes extinct. It's just something that it's part of the definition of what a species is. And yet, there's never been a species like us.
Well, Christopher Hitchens, we might end on that note. Christopher Hitchens was once asked by an interlocutor from the BBC who observed, how does it feel to be dying? And he said, this is when he was in stage whatever it was, esophageal cancer. And he says, oh, but everybody's dying. I'm just doing it a little bit sooner than you. And on that hopeful note, we'll see you at the signing tables.
Yes, please.
Thank you for your attention. And thanks again to the Public Library for hosting us.
Thank you, Steve Wasserman and Obi Kaufmann, for that mind-blowing conversation, honestly.